Tolkien's modern reading, past perspectives, present insights, future study. Tolkien said of The Lord of the Rings that such a story grows like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. Out of all that has been seen or thought or read. Now, for Tolkien, that covers a great deal of material. His great friend C.S. Lewis once commented that Tolkien, as he said, he's the most unmanageable man in conversation I've ever met. He will talk to you all right, but the subject of his remarks will be whatever happens to be interesting to him at the moment, which might be anything from Middle English words to Oxford politics. And his conversation ranged both widely and deeply. The American scholar Clyde Kilby, who spent a summer attempting to assist with assembling Silmarillion, recalled that there was not a single visit I made to Tolkien's home in which the conversation did not at some point fall easily into a discussion of religion, or rather Christianity. He also remarked that Tolkien was a very complex character. I can describe C.S. Lewis, but I can't describe Tolkien. And so when we come to consider the question of his modern reading, I think it's important to begin with an affirmation of that complexity. Tolkien's great knowledge and love of medieval language and literature was hugely important to his thought and profoundly influenced his writings. This is an area that's been very rightly studied in depth. We've already had it touched on in our presentations today, and there's much more that can be said about it. So I want to start by saying that noting one area of influence is not to deny another, whether it's biographical or literary. So with that in mind, let's consider the question of Tolkien's modern reading, from past perspectives through present insights and concluding with a look to the future. During his lifetime, Tolkien provided plenty of evidence that his interests were not limited to medieval literature. For instance, after interviewing him, Charlotte and Dennis Plimmer noted that he dislikes being bracketed with epic writers of the past. In another interview, Daphne Castell asked him what he thought of his writing being called glorified science fiction. And his mild reply was that he supposed it was valid if she means that the pleasure of wonder is also produced by good science fiction, and that this pleasure must be one of the aims of the author. So the same man who spent a lifetime doing painstaking work on medieval poems such as Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight showed no particular interest to being classed among the medieval epic writers, and he was also unruffled about being put in that most modern genre amongst the science fiction writers. Now, what do the reviewers and the critics think? Most of his earliest readers placed him in a medieval context. One writer, looking at The Lord of the Rings, affirmed that in the depths of Middle Earth we hear Snorri Sturluson and Beowulf, the sagas and the Nibelungenlied. And another described it as perhaps the last literary masterpiece of the Middle Ages. Tolkien's use of medieval sources and influences was recognized early on. But even so, there was another element that was noted by some astute readers. Two contributors to an early critical study of The Lord of the Rings described the novel as anomalous and genreless. In 1974, the literary critic Colin Wilson made a direct comparison with Proust and T.S. Eliot, noting that The Lord of the Rings is a significant work of 20th century literature, as significant as Remembrance of Things Past or The Wasteland. Its symbols constitute a kind of exploration of the real world. Another critic, Richard C. West, began his analysis of the medieval interlay structure of The Lord of the Rings by noting that the book is addressed to the modern world, and he goes on to say, lover of the past though he certainly is, J.R.R. Tolkien was nonetheless our contemporary. But this nascent consideration of Tolkien in a modern context, which I think would have naturally led to a consideration of modern as well as medieval and linguistic source material, dampened down considerably after Humphrey Carpenter wrote his biography of Tolkien in 1977 and his joint biography of the Inklings in 1978. In various ways, Carpenter framed Tolkien as essentially backward-looking, interested in nothing later than Chaucer. He downplayed Tolkien's own acknowledgments of influences or inspiration from modern literature, and he summed up Tolkien's reading with the terse and definitive statement, he read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. Now, given that Carpenter was the authorized biographer, and given Tolkien's deep grounding in medieval languages and literature, this is plausible. And I certainly took it at face value for many years, until the research that I was doing for this book eventually piled up so much with so many counterexamples that I was simply forced to reconsider. As it happens, Carpenter was simply wrong on this point. His conclusions, so firmly presented, are not supported by the evidence. But his two biographies came at just the right point to shape attitudes about Tolkien's interest, or alleged lack thereof, in modern literature. Commentators became less interested in, or at any rate less confident about, not only looking at what Tolkien might have read in modern literature, but even less confident about placing Tolkien amongst his literary contemporaries in the modern era. When Tolkien's letters were published in 1981, this volume contained quite a lot of evidence of his wide interests and his wide reading. But a pattern had been set of viewing any instances of his modern reading as basically an exception to the rule, and therefore as less important than his medieval or his linguistic work. Now, there were exceptions to this in terms of scholars looking at individual modern influences, individual texts that he read, but even these scholars tended to present their work in a kind of hesitant way, as if to say, well, I know this isn't really that important, but it's kind of interesting. There's a sense of it being a backwater, not as important, not as relevant. And this pattern was persistent, despite Tom Shippey's observation in 2008 that one of the areas not adequately addressed in Tolkien criticism was, as he put it, the influences on him of writers of the 19th and 20th centuries, so often now deeply unfashionable, forgotten, and out of print. Now, one factor, amongst several, in this hesitance to engage in Tolkien's modern reading was a general hesitance to engage in source study. And this is influenced by Tolkien's own critical remarks about that approach in On Fairy Stories. But this morning we heard John Garth beautifully dismantling Tolkien's views about literary biography, and that applies equally well to Tolkien's consideration of the failings of source study. We have to look at the context in which Tolkien is objecting to these things, and it is not the same context as ours as we consider his sources. But we don't have time to go into that. Writing in the 2014 Blackwell Companion to Tolkien, so we're moving on a few years in our views, Rachel Falconer, for instance, suggested that the search for sources is ultimately unsatisfying because after we've sounded out the echo of Gollum's name in a Rider Haggard novel, where does it leave us? Not much closer to the mystery of origins, because in looking for signs of Tolkien and his predecessors, that is exactly what we will find. And there is truth to this objection. If we assume that literary invention is mechanistic and that tracing sources is like solving a math problem, then looking at Tolkien sources will only disappoint us or lead us astray. And certainly certainly source study can be and has been done clumsily, especially with regard to overzealous claims of one-to-one influences. The number of towers in England that are supposed to have inspired the two towers is probably only exceeded by the number of lampposts that inspired Narnia. Influence is rarely so direct, and it's never exclusive. The power of Tolkien's creative imagination is displayed in the way that he assimilated, transformed, and made something fresh and new out of all that he read. So here we are, 50 years after Tolkien's death, and I believe that we are now emerging into a more well-rounded assessment of Tolkien's engagement with the modern world, recognizing as someone who indeed read a great deal of modern literature, had interesting things to say about it, and made creative use of it, recognizing him as a man who didn't just happen to live in the 20th century, but engaged with it in meaningful ways. And we are beginning to understand more fully how his works have something profound to say to us about our experience in the 21st century. Beppe asked me to speak a little bit about my experience in doing the research for Tolkien's modern reading, and I think I can sum it up by saying that I came to feel a bit like a literary archaeologist, unearthing little mosaic pieces, whether it was from primary sources or from the secondary scholarship, and discovering, first of all, that there were lots of them. They heaped up, and then I had whole handfuls of them, and what am I going to do with these loads and loads of little bits? And then realizing as I looked at them that they fit together into a larger picture and a really interesting one. As it turns out, Tolkien throughout his life read a great deal of modern literature in a surprisingly wide range of genres. We know this for a fact from his letters, from references in his nonfiction writings, from interviews that he gave, and from recollections by friends, family, acquaintances, and students. As of 2021, I put the tally at 149 authors, more than 200 works, with a very stringent system of getting there, taking into account only works of fiction, poetry, or drama in English, published in 1850 or afterwards. And I only counted an author title if I had documentary evidence that he knew it. There are a great many more works that are in the category of probable or possible. They didn't make my list, but they might someday if we get evidence. And even the number of certains has certainly increased since then. For instance, the second edition of Alonzo Chili's Tolkien Library has added a few to that number. And I note the importance of being able to distinguish the certain from the probable or the possible, because there's lots of things you can do with context, with comparative literature, by looking at what he might have read. But if you want to make an argument about influence, about the way that he's working with the sources, I believe to have that rigor, you've really got to be able to say, we know that he read it, or we know that he saw it. We know that it was on his shelves at least, and then you can begin to make a claim. Until you can show that, it's difficult to have that really substance to make source study claims. So what can we discern about Tolkien and his creative imagination from his modern reading? Well, one thing that strikes me is the sheer range and diversity of that reading. He enjoyed science fiction and fantasy, and he kept up to date with it. He read American pulp science fiction magazines, as we know from his very early use of the word robot. He read T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone soon after its publication. We've heard even today that he enjoyed the historical fiction of Mary Renaud. His grandson Michael recollected that he read detective fiction for relaxation and went out of his way to praise Agatha Christie. He enjoyed the fiction of G.K. Chesterton, but not how we might predict. He didn't like the Father Brown detective stories, but he really enjoyed the comic works such as The Flying Inn. And again, this isn't knowing certains allows us to make better and more informed interpretations. Why didn't he like the Father Brown stories? Well, we don't know for sure. He hasn't left us any explanation. But given that he liked Agatha Christie, given that he liked very much the early Dorothy L. Sayers books in which we have Lord Peter Wimsey primarily as detective, but did not enjoy as much the later Wimsey ones, which are more psychological, I think he just enjoyed a good puzzle. And the Father Brown stories are less puzzle and more psychology. So context, knowing what he read, allows us to make more informed assessments of his thought, of his preferences. The leaf mold of his creative imagination was supplied with material by numerous authors, some of whom are long forgotten, such as J.H. Shorthouse, of which I think there are approximately 4 people in the world who have read the whole novel, or S.R. Crockett. Some of those are little known today, like Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison, and others are still well known, such as W.H. Auden, Lewis Carroll, Kenneth Grahame, James Joyce, Edith Nesbit, Beatrix Potter, H.G. Wells, P.G. Wodehouse. And again, context and chronology is important. We mustn't put more emphasis on a book that you read just because it remains popular now. Shorthouse's John Inglesant was a bestseller in its day, read by everyone all the way up to the Prime Minister. So we have to look at context to understand what these books meant to Tolkien. Now, certainly he didn't like everything he read. Who does? For instance, he described William Golding's The Lord of the Flies as dreary stuff. He wasn't wrong. In 1966, Tolkien remarked, "The present mainstream of contemporary literature is so boring, isn't it? I'm offering a pleasant change of diet." But it was because he had continued to read so widely that he was able to assess the contemporary scene and find it wanting. We see this illustrated in his famous wager, so-called, with C.S. Lewis. As Lewis recalled, he remarked to Tolkien, "There is too little of what we really like in stories, and so we shall have to write some ourselves." And so the two of them agreed that Lewis write a space travel story, which became Out of the Silent Planet, and Tolkien agreed to write a time travel story, which became The Lost Road, which in true Tolkienian fashion, he did not finish. And the point here is that in order for Tolkien to agree with Lewis that there is too little of what we really like in current science fiction, he had to be familiar with what was currently on offer, and this lack spurred him to fill the gap. And here we see influence from what he read in a unique way, in a distinctive way. He's spurred by what he doesn't see to write something. On various occasions, he openly acknowledged the ways in which modern fiction shaped his creative imagination. So, for instance, he recalled that George MacDonald and Andrew Lang composed the books which most affected the background of my imagination since childhood. And he specifically named MacDonald as an influence on his goblins and orcs. Now, he later came not to like MacDonald's work, but again, chronology is important. Just because his preferences changed at the end of his life does not mean that he couldn't have been influenced by him earlier in his life. He acknowledged that aspects of The Lord of the Rings owed a debt to William Morris, and he observed that his use of the word crack in The Crack of Doom was, as he said, ultimately derived from Algernon Blackwood, who used it in this way in one of his books, which I managed to find out was The Education of Uncle Paul. Now, if there's one thing that we can definitively say about Tolkien's use of his source material, modern or otherwise, it's that it's never simple, let alone simplistic. So let's consider, as one example, The Hobbits. Tolkien remarked that he had read all of Sinclair Lewis, American novelist of realistic and satiric fiction, and he explained to an interviewer that the word hobbit might have been associated with Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. And he added, "Babbitt has the same bourgeois smugness that hobbits do. His world is the same limited place." But this is not the only source that Tolkien notes for the hobbits. He named E.A. Wick Smith's children's novel, The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, as an unconscious source book for the hobbits. And he also recalled that the warg scene in The Hobbit was, as he put it, in part derived from a scene in The Black Douglas by S.R. Crockett. So we find that Tolkien himself acknowledges that an American satirical novel, a children's fantasy, and a historical adventure novel all contributed something to the creation of the hobbits. He also, in a slightly tongue-in-cheek manner, referred to the hobbits as containing a rabble of Eddaic named dwarves, newfangled hobbits and golems invented in an idle hour, and Anglo-Saxon runes. There's a lot going on, and it's all brought together, digested, assimilated, and transformed in the depths of Tolkien's imagination. Ranging even more widely, John Garth has remarked on the way that the Book of Lost Tales is in fact a fusion of 3 literary genres that Tolkien admired. It is not only a foundational myth for England, like the one that Virgil's Aeneid had furnished for Rome, but it is also a collection of stories within a story, like Geoffrey Chaucer's 14th century Canterbury Tales. And it's a lost world story, like Henry Rider Haggard's She. Classical, medieval, modern elements are all interwoven in the earliest tales of Middle-earth. This complexity, this richly textured way that Tolkien makes use of his source materials is consistent. Tracing one thread of influence does not comprehensively explain or exhaust the meanings of his writings, but rather it helps to illuminate the creative process by which Tolkien brought his imaginative world to life. So where do we go from here? I have 2 observations, the first having to do with content and the second with methodology. As more biographical material becomes available, we will have the opportunity to discover new information that will enhance and deepen and correct our understanding of Tolkien's life, his creative imagination, and the sources and influences that contributed to his writings. I am sure I'm not the only one here who's eagerly awaiting the expanded edition of Tolkien's letters. Yeah, pre-ordered within about 10 seconds of seeing the announcement. And I hope that as we have editions, for instance, of his lectures on Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, Secret Vice, and on fairy stories, that in future years we'll have editions of more of his academic writings and lecture notes. And with the materials that we already have on hand, there's abundant scope for investigating his modern reading more widely. When I wrote Tolkien's Modern Reading, I had to draw the generic and the chronological boundary line somewhere, or else A, I would have gone mad, B, I would never have finished it. And this was a Tolkien influence that I wanted to avoid. So I limited myself, English literature, poetry, drama, prose, and I chose 1850 as the cutoff date for various reasons. But there are a number of figures just on the other side of that line. It's quite agonizing, really. Just the other side of that line who are well worth investigating, such as Sir Walter Scott, whom Tolkien cites as a user of the term Middle-earth. Tolkien also read Blake, Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Jane Austen. All of these we know that he read. That's an area we can investigate more fully. Tolkien also took an interest in English literature from the centuries between the medieval and the modern period. For instance, in 1933, he was a guest of honor at the annual dinner of the Oxford University Mermaid Club, an undergraduate society dedicated to the reading of 16th and 17th century English drama. And he was also a guest at their annual dinner. Yes. I'm almost done. Okay. Yes, sorry. His grandson Michael recalled that when I opted to specialize in 17th and 18th century literature for my second degree in Oxford, he showed equal interest and was full of amusing anecdotes about the authors I chose to read, and he always thought highly of Jonathan Swift. And we could also consider his reading of other languages and of nonfiction. And now my second and final point to relieve you has to do with the importance of context. We have to recognize context when we look at his work, because we need to know not just that we may not have all of the answers, but that we also may not yet be asking all the right questions. So it's possible for important insights into Tolkien's work to be basically hidden in plain sight if we don't know how to access their meaning. So I will just give you one example. considering Tolkien's Smith of Wootton Major. It's a puzzle for scholars in many ways, various reasons, but one of the reasons is that Tolkien says that it contains a religious allegory. He declared that plainly enough, the master cook and the great hall, etc., are a somewhat satirical allegory of the village church and the village parson. And this plainly enough remark has been most perplexing because it is far from plain to most readers. Was Tolkien just indulging in private interpretation at the time? That is what most scholars today have thought. But as it happens, this element of religious allegory seems to have been relatively plain to Catholics at the time that he wrote it. There is a 1968 review of Smith for the Catholic weekly magazine, The Tablet, which notes that exact allegory and straightforwardly assumes that Tolkien is referring, in his writing about the parish church there, that he's talking about the Second Vatican Council. He's even able to use a sort of let the reader understand phrasing because to the reviewer, this is just dead obvious. Now, whether Derek, this reviewer, is right or not is another question. Tolkien might have been talking, for instance, about the Reformation, but he had no trouble picking up the presence of religious allegory at the very point that Tolkien privately identified it. What was visible, however, to Tolkien's contemporary co-religionists is naturally considerably less apparent to others, especially those outside the cultural, historical, and ecclesiological context of English Catholicism. Now, I've only just turned up this piece of information. I don't know where it will lead, but I think it will shed light on our understanding of Smith of Wootton Major and on the specific question of the influence of George MacDonald on that work. Tolkien wrote the story as he was trying to write an introduction to MacDonald's tale of the Golden Key, and he remarks in doing that Smith is an anti-George MacDonald tract. Now, the word tract is very interesting because it usually refers to a pamphlet arguing for a religious point of view, and Tolkien would have had in mind the Tracts for the Times by the Oxford Movement, and the first reading of Smith of Wootton Major was at a joint lecture series with Blackfriars and Pusey House, founded by Edward Bouvier Pusey of the Oxford Movement. So what was Tolkien thinking when he called Smith an anti-George MacDonald tract? Well, I don't know, but I think the particular context of his writing and his public reading of that story makes it an interesting question. So to wrap up, I think we can just take the bigger picture and say, yes, Tolkien's modern reading is just one element in the workings of his creative imagination, and I freely concede that it's not the most important. But an element can be of secondary importance and still be very valuable in the larger picture. I think considering his modern reading helps us appreciate that the process of inspiration is complex. Multiple influences often contribute to the same aspect of creativity. And I think, too, it helps to explain some of the staying power of his work, which has spoken so powerfully to the 20th century and speaks eloquently to the 21st. Thank you.